283 bodies were recovered, of which 42 have been identified. Victims had reportedly been buried deep in the ground and covered with waste. Among the deceased were allegedly older people, women, and wounded, while others were found tied with their hands. They were found with their hands tied and stripped of their clothes.
How close are we? How close are we of talking about crimes against humanity? If we mention what you just said at the beginning of the press briefing, how close?
Oh, thanks, Jeremy. Unfortunately, we have been warning about war crimes since October now. We are horrified also by the destruction of Al-Nasser Medical Complex and Al-Shifa Medical Complex and the reports of the discovery of mass graves in and around facilities. And we call for independent, effective, transparent investigations into the deaths. Given the prevailing climate of impunity, this should include international investigators. Hospitals are entitled to very special protection under international humanitarian law. And let's be clear, the intentional killing of civilians, detainees, and others who are hors de combat is a war crime. But the latest images of a premature child who was taken from the womb of her dying mother, of the adjacent 2 houses where 15 children and 5 women were killed, this is beyond warfare. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights today decried a series of Israeli strikes on Gaza in the past few days that have killed mostly children and women. He repeats his warning against a full-scale incursion on an area where 1.2 million civilians have already been forcibly cornered. Such an operation would lead to further breaches of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and risks even more deaths, injuries, and displacement on a large scale, even further atrocity crimes, for which those responsible must be held accountable. Already in March, the Security Council demanded an immediate ceasefire. The world's leaders stand united on the imperative of protecting the civilian population trapped in Rafah. But the latest images of a premature child who was taken from the womb of her dying mother, of the adjacent 2 houses where 15 children and 5 women were killed, this is beyond warfare. On the 19th of April, an apartment building was hit in Tal al-Sultan area in Rafah, killing 9 Palestinians, including 6 children and 2 women. Another strike on 2 adjacent houses in At-Tanur area in eastern Rafah on the 20th of April reportedly killed another 20 Palestinians, including 15 children and 5 women. A strike on a Shabora camp in Rafah on the 20th of April reportedly left 4 dead, including a girl and the pregnant woman. As of 22nd of April, according to the authorities in Gaza, of the 34,151 Palestinians killed in Gaza, 14,685 have been children and 9,670 women. Another 77,000 have been injured and over 7,000 others are assumed to be under the rubble. Every 10 minutes, a child is killed or wounded. I'll let you calculate how many children must have been killed or wounded since this briefing began today. They are protected under the laws of war, and yet they are the ones who are disproportionately paying the ultimate price in the war. We are horrified also by the destruction of Al-Nasser Medical Complex and Al-Shifa Medical Complex, and the reports of the discovery of mass graves in and around facilities. And we call for independent, effective, transparent investigations into the deaths. Given the prevailing climate of impunity, this should include international investigators. Hospitals are entitled to very special protection under international humanitarian law. And let's be clear, the intentional killing of civilians, detainees, and others who are hors de combat is a war crime. The High Commissioner has said that the unspeakable suffering brought by the fighting, alongside the resulting misery and destruction, starvation and disease, and the risk of wider conflict must end once and for all. We reiterate our call for an immediate ceasefire, the release of hostages and those held in arbitrary detention, and the unfettered flow of humanitarian aid. Moving on to the West Bank, grave human rights violations are continuing unabated in the occupied West Bank. Despite international condemnation of massive settler attacks from the 12th to the 14th of April, facilitated by Israeli security forces, settler violence has continued with the support, protection, and participation of Israeli security forces. During a 50-hour-long operation into Nur Sham refugee camp and Tulkarem city starting on the 18th of April, the ISF deployed ground troops, bulldozers, and drones and sealed the camp. 14 Palestinians were killed, 3 of them children. 10 members of the ISF were also moderately hurt. We have received reports that several Palestinians were unlawfully killed and that ISF used unarmed Palestinians to shield their forces from attack and killed others in apparent extrajudicial executions. Dozens were reportedly detained and ill-treated, and ISF inflicted unprecedented and apparently wanton destruction on the camp and its infrastructure. On the 20th of April, ISF or settlers shot and killed a 50-year-old Palestinian ambulance driver. The ambulance was evacuating 2 Palestinians injured by live ammunition during an attack by settlers accompanied by ISF in Asawiya, Nablus.
Thank you, Ravina, for this polling updates. So let me give the floor to the journalists. I'll start with Benjamin.
Yes, just a quick precision, Ravina. Can you just tell us what's the difference between ISF and IDF?
It's important that we make this distinction, particularly in the case of the West Bank. Now, the West Bank is where Israeli security forces carry out operations in the West Bank. These are law enforcement operations. It's not considered a zone of active conflict. So the framework that applies there is international human rights law. So these are Israeli security forces rather than the IDF, that is the IDF, the Navy, and the Air Force in Gaza.
Thank you. Emma?
Good morning, Ravina. You mentioned 1.2 million forcibly cornered in Rafah. I believe that's down quite considerably from where it was a few weeks ago. Could you confirm how many people have left that area? And is that because they're fearing an incursion? And also, secondly, any sign of these threatened humanitarian islands being created? Israel has spoken about them as being created as a sort of initial step in the Rafah invasion. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. On that, I don't know if OCHA colleagues might have more information. Our information is that, yes, people did try to go back up north. I think you're aware we reported on this last week, I think. People did try to go back to their homes in northern Gaza. Many of them were attacked en route, and there were reports of killings as well. Nowhere is safe, clearly. And there were, but we don't have exact figures. Actually, I don't know if humanitarian colleagues would have more information, or if it's very difficult to determine exact numbers at this point.
I'm looking at the latest I received from OCHA, and I can't see those numbers. But Jens should be with us in 8 minutes, so we can ask him. Please go ahead.
He might be better positioned on that one. And on the creation of these so-called humanitarian islands, no, I mean, let's be clear, it's not possible. There is no safe place in Gaza, and any pretense at creating safe zones is actually dangerous. What we need is an immediate ceasefire. We do not need to facilitate a further devastating attack on Gaza, on Rafah in particular.
I hope that Jens will have a little bit more, because as you know, as you may have seen, the humanitarian coordinator for the occupied Palestinian territory, Muhammad Hadi, visited Gaza yesterday for the first time since his appointment, and he saw the situation on the ground, met with the humanitarian team, visited Khan Yunis, Deir al-Balah, and spoke with members of the community. He saw firsthand the catastrophic situation in Gaza and how the ongoing hostilities are affecting people. So we'll probably be able to have more from Jens. As soon as he comes, we put him on the grill. Yes, Jeremy.
Hi, Ravina. Correct me if I'm wrong. So far, OHCHR have been spoken about possible crimes, war crimes in Gaza. How close are we of talking about crimes against humanity if we mention what you just said at the beginning of the press briefing? How close?
Thanks, Jeremy. Unfortunately, we have been warning about war crimes since October now. The collective punishment of the people of Gaza, the indiscriminate attacks, inherently indiscriminate attacks by Palestinian armed groups firing rockets into Israel, the targeting of civilians, the targeting of hospitals. So we've been warning against war crimes for unfortunately a very long time now, and the High Commissioner has also warned of further atrocity crimes. Now, the atrocity crimes include war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And the High Commissioner has warned of the risk of these atrocity crimes occurring. On crimes against humanity, given the disproportionate attacks, given the very heavy bombings, combined with the lack of effective humanitarian assistance, these are serious concerns that do need to be examined further, whether crimes against humanity are occurring.
Good morning, Ravina. I was wondering if you have any information from your field team on the ground in the OPT on the if they're collecting data on the explosive weapons in populated areas, if you're collecting the evidence of the ordinances. Yesterday there was a report by UNICEF, but it stopped at 2022. The information collected by the arms experts of the UN. Have you been collecting this evidence from all the warring sides on the ordinances used and for potential future use in a tribunal or a war crimes court? Thank you.
Thanks, John. What we have seen is evidence of the use of weapons with wide area effects, explosive weapons with wide area effects, which have had a devastating impact on civilians and can be indiscriminate as well. They make it much more difficult to carry out proportionate targeted attacks. On whether we are on the ground collecting this evidence, no, we're not. You know that the International Criminal Court is engaged in investigations, and so is the Commission of Inquiry on Gaza. And it's really more for the ICC to do this more collection of evidence. What we do is we collect reports of potential human rights violations. Now, these can eventually feed into the processes that take place in a court of law like the ICC, and we would share information with them, but we don't per se collect evidence. We don't have that expertise and that mandate.
John, as a follow-up.
Yes, it's perhaps for Alessandra. If I'm not mistaken, there is a unit of the Office of Disarmament Affairs that collects the data on use of heavy weapons. It's been done in the past, if I recall rightly, in Syria. And you've been collecting it. So is it possible to reach out to this agency and see what they're doing, not only in the conflict in Gaza, but also in Ukraine, Sudan, and other areas? What are they collecting in the use of these weapon systems in heavily populated areas? Thank you.
Sure. We can put you in contact with the colleagues. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, maybe they will have an update on that. Nina.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Ravina. I was wondering if you had any more details about what specifically has happened at Nasser Hospital about the bodies found there, and also there was mention earlier this month about Shifa Hospital bodies found there as well. I don't know if you have any details about that. If you could provide any details you might have. And I had a somewhat related question. It was about the protests that we're seeing in the United States at the universities there and the crackdown on the protests. I don't know if you have a comment on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Nina, for that. Listen, it is very difficult to corroborate information and to verify it. But the reports that we do have are that in relation to Nasser, the Gaza government media office announced that 283 bodies were recovered, of which 42 have been identified. Victims had reportedly been buried deep in the ground and covered with waste. Among the deceased were allegedly older people, women, and wounded, while others were found tied with their hands. They were found with their hands tied and stripped of their clothes. In relation to Al-Shifa, reports suggest that there were 30 Palestinian bodies buried in 2 graves in the courtyard of Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City, one in front of the emergency building and the others in front of the dialysis building. The bodies of 12 Palestinians were identified in this case, and the others have still not been identified. And there are reports that the hands of some of these bodies were also tied. And in total, the Israeli Defense Forces themselves claim to have killed 200 Palestinians during the Al-Shifa medical complex operation. And there are reports that this may be an underestimate, that there may be many more that were killed.
Go ahead.
Apologies. On your question on protests in the U.S., Alessandra will address it as well, but essentially, as you know, the freedom of expression and the freedom of peaceful assembly is guaranteed. This is it's the obligation of a state to ensure that the freedom of peaceful assembly and the freedom of expression can be exercised. Having said that, of course, there can be legitimate restrictions to the freedom of peaceful assembly and the right to freedom of expression. These must be strictly guided by the principles of legality, necessity, and proportionality. And you have heard the High Commissioner time and again raise concerns about anti-Semitic speech, as well as hate speech against Palestinians and Islamophobic speech. Now, such speech needs to be addressed. It needs to be roundly condemned. It's a difficult balancing act. It's an important one, but this is crucial. It is crucial that such speech is stemmed.